Grief changes the geometry of a house, turning familiar corners into shadowed archives where the air just doesn't move right. For 4 decades, I lived with the silence of my mother's disappearance. A silence only broken the day a crumpled, water-stained envelope was slipped beneath my front door, carrying a scent of sea salt and old lilac. I knew the instant I touched the paper that this was the answer to a question I'd stopped asking long ago. Our story centers on Thomas, 60s, a quiet, meticulous archivist living alone in the same drafty coastal home where he spent his childhood. Thomas's mother, Lillian, vanished without a trace in the summer of 1984, leaving behind only the memory of her favorite summer dress and an unfinished book on the bedside table. The arrival of the letter, postmarked recently, yet written 40 years prior, shatters Thomas's carefully maintained emotional equilibrium. The tone is one of profound, restrained yearning, punctuated by the unsettling atmosphere of a deep-seated mystery suddenly resurfacing. The afternoon light, usually so generous in the old house, seemed to hesitate at the windows today. It cast long, uncertain shadows that stretched like forgotten questions across the polished floorboards. I was in Aurelia's room, a space she had inhabited for 70 years. Now it was just a room. The air was heavy with the scent of aged wood and something else, something I couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was just the smell of time itself. I ran my hand over the cool, smooth surface of her mahogany wardrobe, the wood a deep, silent witness to countless dawns and dusks. It was immense, a silent guardian in the corner, holding its secrets close. Aurelia had been gone for a year of slow, quiet letting go. And now the house was mine. Or rather, I was its temporary keeper, tasked with sifting through a lifetime of accumulated memory, deciding what to keep, what to pass on, what simply to release. The task felt sacred and heavy. Every object held a whisper. Every drawer a closed chapter. I'd been working through the clothes, the linens, folding them with a tenderness they might never have received in life. The wardrobe, however, had remained untouched until today. It felt like the final frontier, the heart of her private world. The familiar silence of the house usually felt like a warm blanket, a comfort. Today it was different. It seemed to deepen with each item I touched, each scent I recognized. It wasn't empty but full of quiet anticipation. It pressed in, no longer comforting but almost suffocating. The air grew still, heavy, like before a storm that never breaks. I opened the large central doors of the wardrobe. Inside, hung on wooden hangers, were her dresses. Silk, velvet, wool. Each one a story in fabric. I lifted a heavy, dark blue velvet gown, the kind she wore to winter dinners. It rustled softly like old leaves. My fingers traced the intricate beadwork along the neckline, and for a fleeting second, I could almost feel the phantom warmth of her body, the faint scent of her perfume. It was when I reached into the back, pushing the dresses aside to check for moths, that my hand brushed against something unexpected. A slight give in the wood, a resistance that wasn't solid. Not the usual backing. My breath caught. It was a false backing, cleverly disguised. A thin panel expertly fitted, almost invisible against the dark wood. My fingers fumbled, searching for a seam, a catch. And then I found it. A tiny, almost imperceptible notch. I pressed it gently, and the panel shifted inward with a soft, almost inaudible click. Behind it was a small, hidden compartment. Not empty. Inside, nestled in the darkness, were 2 things. A small leather-bound journal. Its cover was smooth, worn soft with time, the kind of leather that whispers of secrets. And beside it, protected by the journal's weight, a single brittle white rose. I drew them out slowly. The journal felt surprisingly heavy, as if packed with unseen burdens. The rose, impossibly fragile, seemed to shed a faint, ghost-like dust as I lifted it. Its petals, once vibrant, were now the color of old parchment, translucent and delicate, like butterfly wings. It was a stark white, almost luminous in its decay. I held the rose in my palm first. It felt cold. Not cool to the touch, but truly deeply cold, as if it had been preserved in ice rather than pressed. A chill that seemed to seep into my skin, despite the warmth of the room, felt alien, detached. Then the journal. I opened it to the first page. Aurelia's elegant script. So familiar, yet in this context entirely new. The entries were dated, meticulous, spanning decades. Daily observations, weather notes, Reflections on books she'd read. The mundane details of a quiet life. But as I turned the pages, a different thread began to emerge. A creeping unease. The early entries were ordinary enough, but then a subtle shift. Words like shadows lengthened or the wind carried whispers appeared with increasing frequency, imbued with a new weight. She wrote about the first garden. Not a place I knew. It wasn't our rambling, sun-drenched garden with its riot of hydrangeas. This was a different garden. A place hinted at with reverence and a touch of dread. And then phrases like a debt paid in stone. And the weight of the earth. Recurring like a dark melody in the quiet hum of her life. I noticed the subtle changes in her handwriting. In the earlier years it was fluid, graceful. But in the later entries, particularly the last few, there was an urgency. The loops were tighter, the lines sharper, sometimes almost slashing across the page. A tremor, a hurriedness. Not the slow, deliberate hand of my grandmother. This was the hand of someone writing quickly, perhaps in the fading light, perhaps in fear. The last entry was dated just weeks before her passing. It was short. The rose must stay hidden. The earth remembers. The payment is due. My own heart began to beat with a quick, shallow rhythm against my ribs. The silence of the house pressed in harder now. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant rustle of leaves outside, felt amplified, charged with a new significance. It was no longer the quiet of peace, but the quiet of something held back, something waiting to be revealed. I looked at the brittle white rose again. The coldness radiating from it seemed to intensify, a physical manifestation of the chill I felt spreading through me. A single pure white rose, brittle with age, carrying such a heavy dark secret. Why hide it in plain sight, in the heart of her most personal space? What kind of payment? And to whom? The scent of aged paper and dry rose petals filled my nostrils. No longer just a memory, but a puzzle. A cold, unsettling puzzle. I closed the journal, its leather cover now feeling less like a shield and more like a skin holding too much inside. I carefully laid the fragile rose on top, its whiteness stark against the dark leather. The coldness still emanated from it. A silent, persistent query. The long shadows in the room had deepened, stretching like reaching fingers. The afternoon light had almost entirely withdrawn. The house, once a haven, now felt like a repository of unspoken words, of hushed fears. I sat there, the journal and the rose in my lap, feeling the chill of the rose, the weight of the book. Aurelia had lived a life of quiet grace, a gentle soul. Yet here, hidden in the heart of her world, was this secret that had chilled her so completely, haunting her final days. The moon began to rise, a pale, watchful eye in the darkening sky. And I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that the house was not done with me. It was only just beginning to speak. The journal and the cold, white rose had been left on the dresser, covered by a thin linen cloth. I couldn't look at them yet. Instead, I focused on the letter that had arrived this morning. It felt different from the usual junk mail, heavier somehow. The paper was thick, slightly textured, and the envelope itself was a shade of cream I hadn't seen used in decades. I turned it over in my hands, listening to the small, stiff rustle it made. The address was mine, but written in a script that was shaky, unsure. A hand that had either been out of practice or burdened by age. There was no return address. Just a small dark seal of wax, dried and brittle, pressed into the corner flap. And in that seal, beside the blurred impression of something that might once have been a coat of arms, was a partial thumbprint. Dark, clear, and perfectly preserved in the dried, cold wax. It felt like a signature of the past. The letter was another layer of uncertainty piled onto Aurelia's secret. She had guarded her journal and her rose for 40 years, and now, a week after her death, this arrives. It wasn't the closure I craved. It was a new lock on a very old door. I felt a nervous energy building, the kind that makes the small hairs on your arm stand up when you know a moment is important, even if you don't know why. I held the envelope up to the light, trying to see the contents, but the paper was too opaque. I resisted the urge to tear it open. It felt like an invitation to a conversation, and I needed to understand who the speaker was before I listened. The air in the house seemed to warm slightly as the day wore on, but I remained cool, held captive by the paper in my hand. I decided I needed context. I needed the edges of the frame before I looked at the painting. The small-town post office was only a few blocks away. It was an institution here. A single room smelling of old glue and stamped paper, where time seemed to move at the speed of a hand-cranked machine. I walked the distance slowly, the envelope tucked securely inside my jacket pocket. The pavement under my feet felt familiar, yet the journey itself felt like traversing a distance much greater than a few blocks, a distance measured in years. The post office was quiet, just the sound of the air conditioning unit rattling softly, and the occasional thunk of mail hitting a sorting tray. Behind the counter sat Mr. Peterson, the postmaster. He was a man with hands that knew the precise weight of a single sheet of paper and eyes that missed nothing. His gray hair was cut short, his movements economical, grizzled like the worn leather of an old mail bag. I laid the envelope on the counter, the thick cream paper a contrast to the polished laminate. "I was hoping you might recognize the stamp, Mr. Peterson," I said, my voice carefully even. He didn't touch the envelope immediately. He tilted his head, adjusting his glasses, his eyes scanning the surface. He finally picked it up, holding it delicately by the edges like an artifact. His brow furrowed slightly as he found the stamp, a small intricate square with a faded image of a clipper ship. "Well now," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. "That's a fine thing. Haven't seen one of those in person for a long, long time." He pointed a thick, calloused finger at the ship. "The Coastal Promiser series. Used to be common here on the coast. But they stopped printing these particular ones, the blue 6-cent issue, right around the end of '84. Maybe early '85. They changed printers, changed the paper. This is the old stock." My heart gave a faint, quick thud against my ribs. 1984. 40 years. This letter had been waiting for 4 decades to be sent. "Do you remember anyone using it recently?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He shook his head slowly, replacing the envelope on the counter. "No. Nobody comes in here with stamps that old. They just fade away on old postcards in attics." Mr. Peterson leaned closer, his voice dropping slightly, the way people do when they are about to share a detail that only they noticed. "Though funny you should ask about today." He paused, looking past me toward the windows, his gaze fixed on some point in the empty street. "Came in early this morning. Maybe 5:30. Still dark, really. Was unlocking the drop box outside, testing the hinge. And I noticed a woman sitting on the bench across the street, near the old bookstore." He paused again, his eyes returning to me. "She was quite old. Sat very still. Too early for a walk, you see. She was just waiting. I watched her for a moment. Then she got up, almost too quickly for a woman her age. Walked straight to the drop box, dropped something heavy inside and then was gone. Like smoke." "Can you describe her?" I pressed, leaning forward over the counter. He closed his eyes for a moment, recalling the fleeting image. "She was frail, hunched slightly. But her eyes. I remember her eyes. Even in that poor light. They were a bright pale blue. They held the sea's reflection, they did. Like you were looking straight out to the horizon." He tapped his fingers on the counter, remembering one last detail. "And she was clutching something. A bag. A satchel, the kind the old sailors used to carry. Worn leather. Nautical knotwork on the strap. She held onto it like it was the only thing keeping her standing." He looked at the Coastal Promiser stamp again. The connection felt immediate, electric. The sea, the old stamp, the waiting, and the woman who vanished. She looked like someone who had just finished the hardest job of her life, he concluded, picking up another stack of mail, dismissing the mystery with a shrug only a postmaster could manage. But I couldn't dismiss it. 40 years. A promise carried in a sailor's satchel, delivered by a woman with eyes that held the relentless blue of the ocean. The waiting, the finality of the drop box. Who was she? And what kind of promise requires 4 decades of silence, only to be delivered now, days after Aurelia's death? I thanked Mr. Peterson, the words sounding hollow in the sudden rush of information. I left the post office, the doorbell jingling behind me, the sound sharp and final. I stood on the sidewalk, the envelope now feeling hot in my pocket. I looked across the street to the bench he'd mentioned. It was empty now, baked in the midday sun. But I could almost see her there. Frail, silent, clutching her burden. She was the key to Aurelia's secret, a living ghost of the past. She hadn't been able to send the letter 40 years ago. Maybe the promise was too much to complete then. Maybe it had to wait until all the participants in the secret were finally gone or nearly so. I pulled the envelope from my pocket. I looked at the dark thumbprint in the wax, the signature of the promiser. I didn't open it here. I began walking back towards the house, towards the journal and the cold white rose. The mystery was no longer a gentle philosophical ache. It was a tangible thing, a promise finally delivered, waiting for me to break the seal and read its unforgiving contents. The wind picked up, carrying the faint, distant scent of salt and turning the leaves on the trees. Everything felt inevitable now. This chapter provides a perfect opportunity to deepen the quiet tension and focus on the tactile, sensory details. I will integrate the concept of the coated quilt pattern into the reflective, cinematic style. The walk back from the post office was just long enough for the day's warmth to settle uncomfortably beneath my skin. The letter, the coastal promiser, was still in my pocket, sealed. I knew the moment I opened it, the quiet reflection would end and the active search would begin. So I delayed. I needed one more piece of the past, something safe, before facing the sudden sharp reality of the present. I went straight to the attic. The air up here was thick and still, smelling of cedar and sunbaked dust. The house kept its warmest, oldest secrets here under the eaves. I was looking for Lillian's box, my mother's. She hadn't disappeared decades ago, like Aurelia's shadow woman. Lillian had left when I was a boy, quietly, one Tuesday morning, taking only a small satchel and leaving behind everything else. My mother's corner of the attic was marked by a pool of brighter light near a small dusty window. In that light sat a wicker trunk, its lid closed tight. This trunk contained the residue of a life that stopped abruptly. A few photographs, some childhood drawings I had made, and the project she had been working on. I knelt beside the trunk, pushing the lid open with a slow, grinding squeak of wicker against wicker. I didn't have to search for the quilt. It was on top, folded neatly but not pressed, as if she had just finished sewing for the night and intended to pick it up again tomorrow. It was a large, half-finished patchwork. The squares were cut from faded cottons, ginghams, florals, simple solids. It was meant to be a comfort, a blanket against the coastal chill. But now, seeing it, it felt like a deliberate abandonment, a promise of warmth that was never fulfilled. I spread the quilt out over the dusty floorboards. The fabric was soft against my knees, a tangible connection to the last time I had seen her, sitting in her armchair, needle flashing in her hand. The silence of the attic deepened, holding its breath around this object of quiet industry. I began to trace the familiar pattern, the way I used to when I would lie beside her. It was a traditional friendship star pattern, common and comforting. But as my eyes moved across the pattern, I felt a familiar resistance, a small hitch in my memory. I leaned closer, running my fingertips over the rough seams. The quilt was divided into sections. The majority of the squares were alternating shades of cream and rose, forming the standard stars. But then, in the center of one larger block, and then again in the corner of another, were sequences of squares that stood out. Blue, gray, blue, gray, gray. I pulled back, squinting. These blue and gray blocks were sewn together in long, deliberate rows that seemed to ignore the underlying star pattern entirely. They were a separate language, overlaid on the traditional design. The sequence was non-repeating, subtle enough to look like a simple variation in color choice, yet too specific to be random. It was hidden in plain sight. I had been told years ago that my mother had a brief interest in nautical signaling codes before she left. Just a hobby, my father had said dismissively. Now, I thought of the coastal promiser stamp, the elderly woman with the sea in her eyes, and the nautical satchel. I felt a sudden electric certainty. The pattern wasn't random. It was a cipher. I started counting. The blue squares represented one value, the gray squares another. A simple binary code, hidden in the soft fabric. I took a piece of paper from my pocket and began transcribing the sequence, square by square, line by line. It took me nearly an hour, hunched over the quilt in the pale attic light. The dust motes danced around the threads, making the air feel thick with effort. My fingers grew stiff from tracing the rigid patterns. When I finally finished transcribing the last long row, the final sequence of blues and grays, I had a long, unbroken string of numbers. Too long for a phone number. Too precise for a date. I looked down at the sequence. 2 sections of numbers, separated by a distinct break in the stitching, where the last block was sewn directly into the backing fabric. My mind, primed by the nautical motif, suddenly connected the pieces. Latitude and longitude. I scrambled for my phone, my hands shaking slightly now. The screen felt too bright, too modern in the quiet antique setting. I typed the first sequence into the mapping application. The screen zoomed out wildly, then slowly, deliberately, focused on a patch of coastline I vaguely recognized. The numbers resolved into a forgotten location, an abandoned, overgrown tract of marshland and crumbling stone docks, several miles outside of town. It wasn't marked on any tourist map. It was a place the town had actively tried to forget. The coordinates led to a spot right at the edge of the wetlands, where the sea met the solid, uncompromising land. A chill ran down my spine, replacing the gentle warmth of the quilt fabric. It was a desolate, urgent location, not a place for a farewell or a final goodbye, but a place to meet, or a place to hide something. Lillian hadn't just left. She had been preparing. She had used the most common, comforting object in her life, the quilt, to stitch a deliberate, desperate message, hidden in plain sight for all these years. Why there? What did she need me to find in that forgotten, muddy place? I stood up, the quilt dropping softly back onto the floor, its patterns now starkly visible, its colors screaming their silent code. The light in the attic was fading fast, leaving the room heavy with shadows. I picked up the unfinished quilt, folding it carefully, reverently. The stitching was her hand, her thought, her final instruction. It was a different kind of promise than the one in the sealed letter, but equally compelling. I placed the quilt back in the trunk. I didn't need the warmth of its fabric anymore. I had the warmth of certainty. I took the sealed letter out of my pocket. I placed it on the floor next to the small window. I reached up and pressed my finger against the thumbprint in the wax. A silent, delayed handshake with the woman who knew Aurelia's secret. I looked at the number sequence one last time. The coordinates burned into my memory. Marshland. Stone docks. The urgency was no longer an assumption. It was stitched in thread. I had two promises to keep, the one in the sealed envelope, and the one sewn into the fabric. The time for waiting was over. This chapter is the pivotal action and information scene. I will focus on the atmosphere of the derelict docks, the sensory details of the conversation with Mr. Keene, and the emotional weight carried in the harbor master's gaze, all while maintaining the slow, cinematic pace and reflective voice. The air changed immediately as I reached the edge of town. The familiar smell of damp soil and cut grass gave way to the sharp, bitter scent of salt marsh and stagnant water. The roads grew rough, unpaved, leading toward the forgotten section of the coast. This was the crossing, a place where the railway line used to meet the old fishing docks, now just a tangle of rusted tracks and crumbling pilings. It was the location the quilt had whispered to me. The docks themselves were a graveyard of wood and stone. Broken masts lay scattered like bleached bones. Everything here was decaying slowly, consumed by the tireless appetite of the sea and the indifference of time. It was desolate, utterly exposed. This was the place Lillian needed me to find. I parked the car where the asphalt finally dissolved into mud and walked the last stretch. The quiet here wasn't the house's silence. It was a loud, empty silence, the kind that swallows sound and makes you feel intensely alone. The rhythmic, dull slap of small waves against the stone seawall was the only consistent rhythm. I was looking for a sign of life, a structure that defied the pervasive ruin. And then I saw it. A small gray shack, barely more than a weathered cube, sitting right at the end of the main pier, listing slightly. Smoke was threading a thin blue line from its rusty stovepipe. Inside, hunched over a cluttered desk lit by a single bare bulb, was the harbor master, Mr. Keene. He was the keeper of this graveyard, a relic himself. His face was a map of deep, wind-carved lines, and his clothes smelled permanently of brine and old engine grease. He didn't look up when I knocked softly on the open, half-rotted door. He simply waited. I stepped inside. The air was close, heavy with the smell of strong coffee and paper dust. "I'm looking for a memory, Mr. Keene," I said, my voice feeling strangely thin in the cramped space. He pushed a thick pair of glasses up his nose, finally lifting his head. His eyes were startling, a pale, washed-out blue, framed by decades of squinting at the horizon. They seemed to hold an encyclopedic, weary knowledge of every tide and every missing boat. "The docks are quiet now, son," he rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves being scuffed across concrete. "Memories are all they sell down here." "Lillian," I said, careful to pronounce my mother's name softly. "Lillian Thomas. She used to come down here 40 years ago." His gaze didn't waver. A tiny, almost imperceptible muscle twitched near his jaw. "The woman with the restless feet," he confirmed, the name striking me with the force of an unexpected headline. "Yes. She came here often. Not to fish. To look." He pulled a thick, leather-bound ledger toward him, running his finger along a faded entry without looking at it. "She was always asking about the deep-sea charters. The ones that didn't advertise. The ones that went far out, where the compass starts to lie." "Why?" I pressed. Was she trying to leave? Mr. Keene finally looked away from the ledger, his gaze locking onto mine. This was it. The turning point. The eyes that held the sea's reflection. "She wasn't looking to leave the town, son," he said slowly. "She was looking to leave something behind. Or perhaps to fetch something back." He reached into a jar on his desk filled with sea glass and picked out a piece of milky, smooth white glass. He rolled it between his thumb and forefinger. "The night she left," he continued, his voice softer now, "I saw her. Right out there on the main pier." He gestured vaguely toward the crumbling stone. "She was talking to a captain. A man known only as the Navigator." The name landed like a stone in the quiet water. The Navigator. He didn't berth here regularly. Came in maybe twice a year, only at night. Always had a full tank, never a full hold. Took on strange cargo. And stranger passengers. People who wanted to go a long way, and not come back the same way they left. Mr. Keene paused, his pale eyes searching my face, assessing my right to this history. Lillian was talking to him for a long time. They stood in the deep shadow of his boat. She wasn't arguing, but she wasn't easy either. She looked like a woman handing over something precious, something she needed to be gone. Right then, I thought of the quilt, the coded coordinates. I thought of the unsent letter, the 40-year delay. What did she give him? The harbor master shook his head. Didn't see. But she was clutching that satchel. The nautical one. She'd carried it for weeks, like it was bolted to her wrist. When she left the Navigator's side, the satchel was gone. The nautical satchel. The same detail the postmaster had mentioned about the elderly woman who dropped the letter. The connection solidified in my mind, cold and hard as the sea glass in Keene's hand. Lillian had left the satchel with the Navigator. The woman at the post office, the missing promiser, must have retrieved it, perhaps decades later, to finally deliver the sealed letter to me, completing the final phase of Lillian's plan. What was the Navigator's boat called? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Keene finally put the sea glass down. He took a long, slow breath. That was the strange part, the part that always made me look twice at her memory. He paused for dramatic effect, his gaze holding all the weary knowledge of the old coast. The boat had no name painted on its stern, just a symbol. A single dark rose. A single rose. The symbol that connected the coded quilt, the mysterious captain, and the single brittle white rose pressed into Aurelia's journal. Lillian had left something on that boat, something tied to her mother, Aurelia. And she had left a map, the quilt, to tell me where to start looking. I stood there, the full weight of the scene pressing down on me. The desolate docks, the rhythmic slap of the water, the smell of brine, and the unforgiving knowledge in the harbor master's eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Keene," I said, turning to leave. "One more thing, son," he called out, his voice now low and urgent. "The Navigator didn't take cash. He took things of value. Things that held stories." I nodded, stepping back out into the harsh light of the abandoned harbor. I was no longer chasing a memory. I was chasing a valuable story, a secret payload tied to a cold white rose. I knew now what I had to do. The sealed letter was next. Its contents must detail what Lillian left, and what promise the elderly woman had just completed. I had the map and the captain's name. Now I needed the key. This chapter focuses on escalating the tension and making the mystery character a palpable, immediate threat/ally. I will use the sudden fog and the reflection to heighten the cinematic, unsettling atmosphere, keeping the tone gentle but deeply unnerved. I opened the letter immediately upon returning from the docks. The contents were brief, chillingly impersonal. A single line of Latin, a number, and a date 30 years in the future. It offered no explanation, only a new, deeply cryptic layer of complexity. The promise was not a confession, but another instruction, another burden. I needed context. I needed to understand what had set Lillian on this path. The local library archives were the logical next step. A place of procedure and sterile fact, a counterpoint to the wild speculation of the docks. I spent the late afternoon surrounded by the quiet, dusty calm of microfiche readers and bound records. I found the missing persons report for Lillian Thomas, filed days after her disappearance. It was exactly as Mr. Keene had hinted. Thin, procedural, without color. No struggle, no suspicious activity. No witnesses who saw anything but a woman walking away. The report was a testament to the efficient way the world moves on from the quiet, small tragedies. It yielded no new information, only confirmation that my mother had vanished with bureaucratic ease. The sterile details were a cold comfort, stripping the mystery of its poetry but not its urgency. It was almost dinner hour when I left the library. The sun had already dipped, and a sudden dense coastal fog had rolled in. It was thick and immediate, the kind that blankets the world in an unnatural, deafening silence. It muted the streetlights into hazy, golden orbs and turned familiar shapes into blurred, unsettling shadows. The fog always carried a specific feeling here. A sense of being utterly alone, yet simultaneously watched. Every step I took sounded unnaturally loud on the wet pavement. I kept my hand in my pocket, feeling the stiff paper of the cryptic letter, and the transcribed coordinates of the quilt. I was walking through the town, yet I felt miles away, deep inside the unresolved history of two women. I passed the old section of Main Street, where the storefronts were dark and heavy with the history of vice and secrecy. One establishment, the Sailor's Rest, was an old tavern known for its shadows and its silence, a place where business was conducted in hushed tones and the truth was rarely served with the beer. I was walking past its broad, dark window, trying to orient myself in the disorienting fog, when it happened. My gaze flickered across the glass, seeking my own reflection for a brief anchor in the shifting gray world. But I saw something else. Inside the tavern, in the deep shadow of a corner booth, I caught a second reflection. The faint, ghostly image of an elderly woman. She was sitting alone. She was wearing a heavy, dark coat, and her hands were clasped over a large, worn nautical satchel. The same satchel Mr. Keene had mentioned. The same woman the postmaster had described, the missing promiser. Her face was impossible to read in the dim light, but her eyes, those pale, clear eyes that held the sea's reflection, were focused entirely on me. It was not a casual glance. It was an intense, deliberate watch. Her presence here, miles from the post office and the library, suggested a current, active connection to the mystery. She was not a ghost, she was an agent. I stopped dead on the sidewalk. My feet felt suddenly rooted to the cold, wet pavement. The fog swirled around my knees. The encounter was electric, startling. A direct confrontation with the quiet, persistent force that had delivered the letter. Before I could move, before I could even formulate the question that sprang to my lips, "Why are you following me?" The reflection vanished. Not because she moved, but because a heavy, dark curtain was swiftly drawn across the window pane. It was a practiced, economical movement. No fumbling. No second thought. Just a sudden, sharp obliteration of the scene. The silence that followed was immense, deeper than the fog. It was the silence of a secret being protected, not out of fear, but out of cold, hard necessity. I stood there staring at the dark, flat curtain. The urgency of the letter, the finality of the coordinates, now seemed to be actively managed by a third party. She hadn't tried to speak to me at the post office, even though she had my address. She hadn't left a note. She had simply delivered the instruction, the letter, and now she was watching the messenger, me. Why? If she was simply delivering a promise for Lillian, why wait 40 years and then lurk in the shadows? If she was an ally, why the elaborate secrecy? The only answer that made sense was that her purpose went beyond mere delivery. She was protecting something. Or perhaps she was gauging my readiness. She needed to know that the person receiving the key, the letter, Was the person meant to open the lock? The coordinates. The cold from the fog was starting to seep into my bones, a physical mirror of the chill I felt from this encounter. The mystery was alive, and it was watching my every move. I didn't try the door. I knew the tavern was a place where information was bought, not demanded, and I had the distinct chilling feeling that she was waiting for me to make the next move, not to interrupt hers. I walked the rest of the way home quickly, the fog wrapping around me like a winding sheet. The quiet felt suffocating now. I found myself rushing to the dresser, pulling back the linen cloth. The journal, the coordinates, the cryptic Latin in the letter, they all pointed in one direction. But now I had to consider a new element, the gaze of the watcher in the fog. She was a moving part, a human contingency. She was a guardian, not a messenger. She was waiting for me to act on the instruction. I picked up the sealed letter again, tracing the thumbprint in the wax. The promise had been delivered, but the promiser was still here, monitoring the terms. The next destination was clear. The coordinates. I just needed to know if I was going alone. This chapter is the climax of the setup, where the intellectual puzzle resolves into a physical, emotional realization. I will focus on the atmosphere of the open water, the boat operator's terse, knowing dialogue, and the chilling significance of the coordinates being over water, all delivered with the required quiet intensity. The morning was cool, but the stillness of the air promised a harsh, relentless sun later. I stood on the small, rickety wooden jetty, the cryptic letter finally open in my hand. Its single strange line resonated with a cold, clear logic. The lock is made of water. I looked down at the coordinates transcribed from Lillian's quilt. I had been mapping them onto the land, looking for a building, a hidden structure. Now I saw the truth. The numbers resolved not to the derelict docks, but several hundred yards beyond them. They marked a spot in the open bay, a precise location on the shifting surface of the sea. The urgency was no longer a question of when to go, but how. I needed a boat. I needed a captain who didn't ask questions. I found him at the end of the jetty, Mr. Silas. He ran a small charter for tourists who wanted to fish, but his eyes held the deep, indifferent patience of someone who had long since stopped caring about the day's catch. He was taciturn, his movements slow and deliberate, like a man saving his energy for a fight he knew was coming. I showed him the coordinates. He didn't look at the numbers. He looked at me, then out at the bay, where the morning mist was clinging low to the surface. "That's not where people fish," he stated, his voice flat, emotionless. "I know," I replied. "It's where I need to be." I offered him cash, more than the trip was worth. He took the money without counting it, securing his boat's lines with efficient, silent movements. He was a professional in the business of transporting silence. The small fiberglass boat smelled of old gasoline and yesterday's fish. The engine coughed to life, a rough, mechanical sound that tore through the quiet morning. We pushed off, leaving the familiar shoreline quickly behind us. The land seemed to recede, taking with it the solid ground of my certainties. Out on the open water, everything changes. The light is sharper, the sound is louder, and the distance from shore feels vast, inescapable. We cut through the water, the spray cool and immediate on my face. Mr. Silas navigated by the numbers I had given him, occasionally checking a small, older model GPS. He wasn't charting a course. He was following an instruction. The coordinates led us to a single buoy. It was older than the rest, rusted and worn, bobbing gently in the easy swell. It had no number, no clear municipal mark. It was simply a marker of absence. The very presence of the buoy, ignored by all other boat traffic, confirmed the location's significance. Mr. Silas cut the engine. The sudden silence was absolute. Only the small, hollow clanging of the buoy against the water's surface punctuated the vast quiet. "This is it," he said, not looking at me. "Right under us." I looked down into the water. It was a deep, uncompromising blue-green, clear enough to see the wavering shadows of small fish, but too dark to see the bottom. The depths felt immense, holding their breath. "Why do people avoid this spot?" I asked, my voice hushed. Mr. Silas picked up a frayed piece of old rope, coiling it slowly in his lap. "It's the quiet," he muttered. "Too much quiet." He then gave me the information, not as a conversation, but as a deposition, facts delivered against his will. 40 years ago, he began, his eyes fixed on the coil of rope. Around the time your mother disappeared, there was another vessel that went missing. Small private boat. Local man. Not a fisherman. Just a private vessel that kept to itself. He paused, letting the single rhythmic clank of the buoy fill the space. It vanished right here. No distress call. No wreckage found. Just gone. The Coast Guard searched for a week. They marked the last known ping right where that buoy sits. He looked up at me then, his gaze heavy and direct. They said it was an engine fault or a rogue wave. But the men who work the water know better. A boat doesn't just swallow itself whole without a ripple. The date. The same date Lillian vanished. What was the name of the boat? I asked, bracing myself. He shook his head slowly. Never had a name on the stern, same as the navigator's boat. Just a single symbol. A dark faded rose. The final piece of the code clicked into place, cold and sharp. The missing private vessel was the navigator's boat. The boat where Lillian was last seen talking, where she left her satchel. The boat marked with the same rose as the secret in Aurelia's journal. Lillian hadn't been a passenger seeking escape. She had met the navigator here, at this lonely watery crossroad. But did she meet her end here, swallowed by the sea? Or was this the lock, the watery gate, to her final destination, the place where she made her impossible payment? I realized the profound, terrifying elegance of Lillian's final message. The quilt gave the coordinates. The letter gave the code phrase. The lock is made of water. The lock wasn't a structure to be opened. It was a spot to be reached. It was a point of final transaction. I looked down at the dark water, the sunlight glinting off the surface like scattered pieces of glass. This wasn't a grave. This was a drop-off point. A place where something was hidden, or something was transferred. I had the coordinates, the code, and the silent boat operator who had unknowingly brought me to the very spot where my mother had made her final decisive choice. The buoy clanged again, a solitary metallic tolling over the deep silence. I didn't ask Mr. Silas to stay. I knew I couldn't dive here, couldn't search the depths of the bay. The next step wasn't about finding wreckage. It was about understanding why. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the crumpled letter, smoothing the cryptic Latin on my thigh. The promise was not over. The promise had simply been submerged. We turned the boat, leaving the lonely buoy to clank its perpetual warning. I was heading back to shore, but the true journey had just begun. The key must be in the letter. I had to unlock the Latin. This chapter marks the major emotional reveal, shifting the narrative from detection to understanding. I will focus on the intimate, contained atmosphere of the antique shop, Maeve's quiet grief and weariness, and the emotional weight of her 40-year promise, maintaining the required gentle, reflective tone. The address wasn't a residence. It was a dusty, cluttered antique shop tucked away on a side street, far from the harbor's salt air and the town's scrutiny. The sign above the door read, "The Quiet Finds," painted in faded script. It was the perfect hiding place for someone who wanted to watch without being seen. I felt the paper of the cryptic letter in my hand, the Latin instruction, and understood why the watcher had chosen this sanctuary. I pushed the door open. A small bell jangled overhead, its sound thin and sharp in the sudden silence. The air inside was thick, heavy with the smell of old wood, aged paper and faint lavender, the very scent that had clung to Aurelia's scarf. Every object felt loaded with a past I didn't know. I found her in the back, seated at a tall antique cutting table near a window. Maeve. The light was poor, but she didn't need much. She was hunched over a piece of intricate embroidery, her fingers moving with the precise, deliberate rhythm of a person whose work had become meditation. She didn't look up immediately. She knew I was coming. Her presence felt like an extension of the house's silence, only this time, it was a silence I could finally speak to. I approached the table slowly, careful not to disturb the fragile tableau of thread and old lace. "Maeve," I said, her name a quiet question in the cluttered space. Her hands stilled. She set the small, bright needle down carefully, anchoring it in the fabric. She finally raised her head. The pale, sea-blue eyes of the postmaster's account were startlingly clear, but ringed with an immense, quiet weariness. "Thomas," she replied, her voice low, raspy, but unexpectedly gentle. It was the voice of a deep well, rarely drawn from. "You found the rose. You found the water. There was no accusation in her tone, only recognition. I pulled the nautical satchel from my pocket, the one Mr. Keene had confirmed she carried, which I had retrieved from the back seat of the car. It was heavy worn leather marked by salt and sun. I placed it gently on the table. "It took you 40 years to deliver this," I said, nodding toward the letter inside the satchel. "Why the delay?" Maeve reached out and placed her palm flat on the worn leather of the satchel. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through her hand. "It was never just a satchel," she murmured. "It was the only piece of the promise I was allowed to keep. Lillian gave it to me that night on the dock, right before the navigator took her out to the crossing. She was a young friend of Lillian's," she explained. "A fellow seeker. She had worked on the navigator's boat. A quiet hand, hauling lines and mending sails, asking no questions. Maeve was there the night Lillian boarded. She saw the final exchange. Lillian was afraid, but she was resolute," Maeve whispered, her eyes distant, fixed on a memory. "She told me that the only way to truly protect the inheritance, the family's true history, not the lie they told, was to make it disappear. Submerge it. The house, Aurelia's guilt, the garden. It was all tainted. I thought of the cold white rose and Aurelia's entry. A debt paid in stone. She asked me for one thing," Maeve continued, her voice catching slightly. "To hold this satchel and the letter inside. She made me promise, swear on the sight of the sea, that I would deliver it to you, Thomas, only when I was safe and sure." Maeve closed her eyes for a moment, letting out a small, quiet sigh. The air seemed to compress with her grief. "What did safe and sure mean?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "It meant that the people who were searching had stopped looking," Maeve said, her voice dropping to a confessional whisper. "It meant that I had made certain no one could follow the trail. It meant I had spent 40 years running silent, changing names, moving inland, until I was certain they had forgotten about the rose, and the last person who saw Lillian alive." She opened her eyes, and the sheer, exhausting length of her vigil was reflected in them. "The promise was the hardest knot I ever had to tie, Thomas. 40 years of watching the water, waiting for the all-clear that never seemed to come. It wasn't until Aurelia passed, and I knew the debt collector was finally gone from the house, that I felt a change in the air. The final piece of their secret was buried with her." Maeve leaned forward, her elbows resting on the table, her gaze pleading. "Lillian didn't leave because she wanted to escape you, Thomas. She left because she knew the secret she was carrying, the family inheritance, was too dangerous to keep on land. She knew she had to disappear to protect the next generation. She had to become a lie made of water so the truth could surface later." "And the letter? The cryptic instruction?" "That is the instruction for the retrieval," Maeve said, her voice now firm. "The time for watching is over. The time for finding has begun. I have fulfilled my part of the promise. Now you must fulfill Lillian's." I looked down at the satchel, at the embroidery on the table, at the hands that had moved so precisely, carrying such an immense, silent burden. Maeve was not a villain or a conspirator. She was a quiet hero of profound loyalty, an unwilling agent of a 40-year plan. The fog outside the window had begun to lift, replaced by a thin, diffused sunlight. The room, for the first time, felt less cluttered and more sacred. Maeve reached into the satchel one last time. She pulled out a small flat object wrapped tightly in oilcloth. "This was the most precious thing Lillian had with her," Maeve said. "She gave it to the navigator as the final payment. But she made him promise that when he reached his destination, he would give it to me, Maeve, the next time he passed the crossing." She placed the oilcloth-wrapped object into my hand. It was cold, strangely light and square. "It is the last piece of the lock. It is what Aurelia was trying to hide, and what Lillian was trying to save. She didn't need to tell me to open it. Her work was done. Mine, however, was just starting. I had the code, the location, and now the final piece of the lock. This chapter provides the final, devastating piece of the emotional puzzle, the reason for Lillian's penance. I will focus on the reveal of the silver locket and the meaning of earning the right, contrasting the lush, secluded island with the weight of the debt, maintaining the quiet, reflective tone. The object Maeve had handed me was still resting in my palm. Wrapped in oilcloth, it felt flat, cold, and strangely light. Before I could unwrap it, Maeve placed her worn hand over mine, stopping me. She knew the unwrapping would be the true end of the quiet conversation. "The lock is made of water," she said again, quoting the cryptic letter. "The key is a place, Thomas, not a thing." I looked at her, her eyes steady and clear. The navigator didn't take her to a hideout, I realized aloud. He took her to a destination. He took her to the sanctuary, Maeve confirmed, the name heavy with significance. A place built for those who need absolute silence, absolute distance. The room in the antique shop, already crammed with the silent histories of objects, seemed to expand around us, accommodating the geography of a new, hidden world. Maeve began to describe it. A remote, small island unrecorded on any modern chart. It was known only to a few, a self-sufficient community founded decades ago by people who had simply tired of the noise of the mainland. They lived off the sea and the fertile, sheltered land. A true hidden village, known for its beautiful unrecorded wildlife and its absolute privacy. The navigator was their only occasional link to the outside world. Lillian was going there to live, Maeve whispered. To work. To wait. I thought of the single, cryptic instruction in the letter, and the 40-year delay. She was planning to return? "Oh yes," Maeve said, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. But only when she felt she had earned the right to return. That was her exact phrasing. A debt cannot be paid in mere distance, Thomas. It must be paid in service, in penance. The pain of this realization, that my mother hadn't fled us, but was enduring an exile imposed by a profound secret guilt, was immense. Maeve then revealed the small familiar item Lillian had asked her to keep, not as a transaction, but as a tender, deeply personal plea. She kept the satchel, the promise to deliver the key. But she asked me to hold something else back, Maeve explained, reaching into the pocket of her seamstress apron. Something that was hers and hers alone. She said it was too precious to take into the sanctuary, but too painful to leave behind. She withdrew a small heavy object wrapped in a piece of faded blue silk. She unwrapped it and placed it in my hand beside the oilcloth bundle. It was a silver locket. It was small, tarnished now, and intricately engraved with my initials on one side and a single stylized L on the other. I felt a sudden cold shock of recognition that went straight to the core of my memory. My fingers closed around the familiar weight and shape. I knew this locket. "I gave this to her," I stated, the words catching in my throat. "When I was 12. I saved my allowance for a year. It was a terrible, cheap thing, but she cried when I gave it to her." The simple weight of that cheap silver locket, a small boy's earnest gift, contained the devastating emotional reality of Lillian's exile. This was the one thing she could not risk losing, but also the one thing that would have made her penance impossible to bear. Why couldn't she take it? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Why leave the one thing that tied her to us? Maeve's eyes glistened, mirroring my own sudden sharp pain. Because Thomas, the life she was running from, the debt, was tied to a profound failure of love. A choice she made that harmed Aurelia, harmed you, and ultimately harmed herself. She believed that until the debt was completely wiped clean, until she had earned absolution through time and solitude, she had no right to wear that locket. The word debt hung in the air, a physical presence. It wasn't monetary or even legal. It was a moral debt, a penance. I finally understood the emotional rhythm of Lillian's life. She hadn't fled out of self-preservation, but out of self-condemnation. She was running from a truth that required a 40-year sentence of anonymity and service before she could feel worthy of wearing her son's love again. The locket was the physical manifestation of the love she felt she had forfeited. The debt paid in stone, I murmured, recalling Aurelia's journal entry. Aurelia knew the secret, Maeve confirmed, nodding slowly. She knew the price Lillian was paying, and in her own guilt she tried to protect you from ever finding out. She tried to bury the secret with her. I held the locket and the oilcloth packet, the love and the key, in my hands. The locket felt heavy with the weight of 40 lost years, a small cold monument to a mother's penance. I looked at the oilcloth package, finally peeling back the layers. Inside, gleaming faintly, was a simple tarnished brass key. Not a fancy one, but the kind of robust key that opens a solid old lock. Maeve looked at the key and sighed. That is the key to the cabin, she said. The small, self-built cabin Lillian was assigned when she first arrived. She swore she would not move to a better one until she was ready to return. She pointed to the locket in my other hand. She asked that if I ever delivered this satchel, I tell her son that her penance was long, but her love was always immeasurable, and that the key must be brought to her. My mother was still alive. She was waiting on a secluded island, waiting for the day she believed she had earned the right to put on the locket. I looked down at the brass key, then out the window at the familiar busy street. The map was complete. The destination was clear. The penance, however, was about to end. This chapter is a quiet confirmation, using the physical evidence of the logbook and the leaf to establish Lillian's successful arrival while hinting at immediate, unspoken trouble. I will focus on the sensory details of the old logbook, the symbolism of the smudge, and the hopeful realism of the pressed leaf, maintaining the reflective, cinematic tone. The brass key and the silver locket were now tucked safely away. I turned my attention back to Maeve. She was standing by the antique table, her posture straight, the immense burden of her 40-year promise finally lifted. She looked fragile, yet infused with a quiet resolve. "The key tells you where to go," Maeve said, her voice clear. "But you need to know what you're walking into. Not just the physical landscape, but the emotional one." She walked slowly over to an old, glass-fronted cabinet filled with nautical instruments. She opened it with a practiced hand, retrieved a worn object, and placed it on the table between us. It was a logbook. Heavy leather-bound, its pages stained by salt and time. This was the navigator's final record, entrusted to Maeve upon his passing years ago, the final piece of documentation regarding Lillian's journey. The book felt cold and solid, a tangible link to the man who carried my mother away. I handled it with the reverence due to a sacred, dangerous text. I flipped through the heavy pages. The handwriting was sharp, economical, tracking weather, tides, and destinations across decades. Most entries were mundane, a factual chronology of the sea's indifference. I followed the timeline, past the delivery of the satchel to Maeve, past the navigator's return to the derelict docks. The entries thinned, the last few pages reserved for the final year. The journal was a man's testament to order, to the rules of the sea. Yet, I knew the last entry would break that order. I reached the end, the final entry. It was dated just 3 days after Lillian's disappearance, recording the last time the navigator docked the vessel bearing the single dark rose. The page was a study in abrupt finality. The lines began normally, detailing the coordinates of the island, the weather upon approach, smooth passage, low morning fog, light swelled, all written in the navigator's familiar steady hand. But then the text disintegrated. The entry broke off mid-sentence. The last few lines of his usually precise script were illegible, smudged heavily by what looked like a sudden violent splash or spill. The ink bled outward in dark, star-like patterns, obscuring the crucial words that followed the point of Lillian's arrival. The blot was heavy, dense, and final. It felt like a deliberate act of erasure, a forced silence. I traced the edge of the smudge with my finger. It was dry now, a permanent wound on the page. Had he been interrupted? Had something fallen on the desk? Or had the sudden, clear truth of what he was recording made his hand shake? The logbook, the very symbol of rational order, had been violated at the precise moment of arrival. My eyes moved away from the smudge and rested on the margin of the page. Here, in direct contrast to the sudden, chaotic violence of the spill, a small, intricate detail stood out. Neatly pressed flat against the page, held in place by a single carefully placed strip of aged tape, was a small dried leaf. It was delicate, its veins a fine network of gold against the dark paper. It was clearly not from a mainland tree. Maeve leaned in, her eyes focusing on the leaf with a gentle familiarity. "It's from the silverwood pine," she whispered. "It only grows in the high, sheltered valleys of the sanctuary island. Its sap is highly medicinal." A confirmation, an undeniable piece of evidence. The leaf, pressed and preserved, was the ultimate proof that Lillian reached the island. The navigator, in his final meticulous action before the logbook was violently silenced, had pressed a piece of the destination into the page. The contrast between the two elements, the violent, smudged ink that suggested immediate trouble, and the carefully pressed leaf that symbolized quiet, established life, was unsettling. What happened in the moment between Lillian stepping onto the sanctuary island and the navigator closing his book for the last time? Why the immediate chaos, followed by the quiet order of the pressed leaf? The leaf suggested Lillian was safe enough to collect a souvenir. The smudge suggested the navigator was not. I carefully closed the logbook. The smell of salt and old paper was potent. The truth was now laid bare. Lillian had succeeded. She had reached her self-imposed exile. But the logbook had hidden a new question within its confirmation. The leaf was Lillian's trace, but the smudge was the navigator's final secret. A secret that had nothing to do with Lillian's departure, but everything to do with the consequence of it. He was the one who delivered the final message, the one who took the last payment. And his final moment of record-keeping had been violently interrupted. I looked at Maeve. She was watching me, waiting for the final realization. The key goes to the cabin, I said, my voice steady. The locket is the love she is waiting for. But the smudge? The smudge is the price of passage, Maeve finished softly. The sea takes its due, Thomas. And sometimes, its collectors are men who use its darkness for their own profit. She reached out and took the logbook, tucking it away again. The time for looking back was over. The logbook gave me certainty, but the key demanded action. I had the key to the cabin, the map of the quilt, and the locket of love. The final journey was no longer an archaeological dig into the past, but an active pursuit into the present. This is the final heart-wrenching twist, revealing Lillian's proximity and final solitary act of penance. I will focus on the reveal of her final years, the emotional geography of the cemetery, and the symbolism of the lily of the valley to deliver a quiet, devastating conclusion, staying strictly within the required cinematic and reflective style. The brass key and the silver locket felt suddenly heavy in my hand, useless against the new, unsettling certainty provided by the logbook. I had believed Lillian was alive, waiting for me on a remote island. Now I faced Maeve, sensing the immense, final layer of truth she had protected. Lillian did not stay on the island, I stated, the realization cold and clear. She came back. She was the woman at the post office, wasn't she? Maeve nodded slowly, her pale eyes holding a deep sorrow that transcended the decades. She was the missing promiser, Thomas, and the watcher in the fog. She completed her penance on the island, but the true burden was returning to the mainland and staying away from you. Maeve finally revealed the full truth of Lillian's exile. After a few short years on the sanctuary island, years she spent tending the silverwood pines and working in silence, paying her ethical debt, Lillian decided her presence on the island was no longer necessary. She had successfully hidden the secret, and the key far from the interested parties on the mainland. But the penance was not over. She couldn't stay away from you entirely, Maeve explained, her voice a low murmur. She came back to the town incognito, a quiet hand in a small seamstress shop, living a life of absolute anonymity, always watching you from a distance. The truth was a sudden physical punch. All those years she had been nearby, sitting in a coffee shop I frequented, passing me on the street. Her penance was not the distance but the proximity, the deliberate choice to endure the immense pain of seeing her son grow up, thriving, yet never approaching him, never speaking. She kept the secret to honor Lillian's desperate need for emotional space. Maeve concluded, her eyes pleading for understanding. She believed that if she approached you, the past would follow. The safety would be broken. Maeve stood up slowly, her frailty evident, yet her purpose clear. The key is no longer for the island cabin, Thomas. It is for a lock you can't see, but you must open. She led me out of the antique shop and back toward the familiar roads, but turned us toward the municipal cemetery, a quiet, sprawling field of stone and mossy monuments on the edge of town. The air here was softer, filled with the scent of damp earth and evergreen trees. We walked past rows of markers, past names I didn't know, until we reached an unmarked section near the oldest stone wall. There were many plots here that had no names, the forgotten, the anonymous. Maeve stopped at a small, unassuming patch of earth. There was no stone, no marker, no inscription. It looked like any other piece of grass, save for one distinct, heartbreaking detail. Resting on the damp earth was a small, constantly renewed cluster of fresh lily of the valley. The sight of the flowers was devastating in its quiet certainty. Lillian's favorite flower. The flower she always requested for her birthday, even as a girl. They were simple, elegant, their small white bells symbolizing a return to happiness. a hope she had clearly held onto even in her final anonymity. Maeve knelt stiffly beside the unmarked earth, her hand hovering over the delicate white bells. "She came home to die," Maeve whispered, tears finally tracing silent, slow paths through the windlines on her face. "Not on the island but here, where she could be near you in the earth without risking your safety." She confirmed the ultimate, quiet act of penance. Lillian had returned a few weeks prior, found a small, isolated room in town, and passed away quietly and alone. Maeve had been the only one there at the end, honoring the promise to keep the anonymity absolute. She had seen to the simple, unmarked burial. "She was free, Thomas," Maeve said, her voice cracking. "The debt was paid. But the emotional space she created, the distance from her failure, had become her only comfortable reality. She couldn't step out of the shadow without feeling the guilt return. I fell to my knees, the damp earth cold beneath my trousers. The key and the locket slipped from my grasp, falling onto the soil beside the flowers. The final journey was a few feet away. I picked up the silver locket. It was tarnished but beautiful. It was the love she had held onto for 40 years, the symbol of the connection she felt unworthy of. She had died before she could put it on. I placed the locket gently into the earth, nestled amongst the white, silent bells of the lily of the valley. The final payment was made. The key to the cabin was now the key to the past, a lock that could only be opened by forgiveness. The true question was not what debt she was running from, but whether she had ever truly forgiven herself for the necessary, painful act of leaving. Her quiet, solitary return suggested the answer was no. The debt was paid, but the penance had become her life. I looked at Maeve, the only keeper of this long, sorrowful truth. She had finished her vigil. Now mine began. I had to forgive the silence, and let the quiet woman under the lily of the valley finally rest. The inheritance was not a buried secret, but the immense, quiet knowledge of a mother's immeasurable sacrificial love. This final chapter requires a shift from narrative action to deep, reflective closure, answering the prompt by projecting Thomas's future emotional state and choices, guided by the immense truth he has uncovered. The cemetery air was quiet, the only sound the low hum of the distant town. I stood over the unmarked earth, the cluster of fresh lily of the valley, a small white beacon against the dark soil. The scent of the flowers, a fragile perfume of innocence and hope, was mixed with the lingering salt and the faint scent of lilac that still clung to the old cream-colored letter from the post office. The letter, the key, the coordinates, they had all been a diversion. The physical journey had always been secondary. I finally understood the profound truth of the coastal promiser. The letter wasn't about her location. It was about her intent. It was a sealed promise of return, delivered at the only moment it could be, when the risk was gone and the message could be received without danger. The real delivery was not the paper, but the closure, finally delivered by Maeve after honoring a difficult promise. Maeve was the final witness, the agent of Lillian's peace. She had traded her own life's ease for the protection of my future, and for that, she was the true custodian of the family's honor. I knelt again, the dampness of the earth seeping into my clothes, but I didn't care. I felt anchored here, in a way I hadn't felt in the restless years of seeking. The entire elaborate puzzle, the coated quilt, the harbor master's gaze, the watcher in the fog, was not a desperate hunt for a secret, but a carefully guided lesson in my mother's sacrificial love. Every step I took was part of her final beautiful communication. She hadn't returned to claim her life. She had returned to pay her ultimate price, the final penance of dying alone, ensuring her quiet, anonymous burial would never draw attention to the secrets she had protected. I thought of the locket I had given her, the cheap, silver thing I bought as a boy, the gift of a love she had felt unworthy to wear for 40 years. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the tarnished silver locket. I held it for a long minute, feeling the familiar heavy weight, the small, enduring proof of a mother's immeasurable love and a son's devotion. It was no longer a symbol of absence, but a token of presence, the presence of her penance, the presence of her proximity, the presence of her love in the final years. Slowly, deliberately, I placed the locket gently atop the fresh lilies, nestling it among the white, bell-shaped blossoms. It was the final act of the ritual. I was not receiving her love. I was releasing her from her penance. I was giving her the right to wear it, now in the stillness of the earth, where the judgments of the past could no longer touch her. The action was simple, quiet, and profound. The last connection was severed, not in sorrow but in acceptance. I stood up, leaving the flowers, the locket, and the silence. I walked away from the cemetery not as a son who had been abandoned, but as a man who had finally understood the impossible choices his mother had made. The question now, the one that lingered in the salt air and the silence of the town, was how I would choose to live with my own past. Lillian had chosen to pay her debt by creating emotional space, by denying herself the right to love and presence. Her life was an immense, sorrowful lie told to protect the future. My choice must be the opposite, embracing proximity, not penance. I would stop seeking dramatic fulfillment in distance and mystery. Lillian's return, however tragic, was an argument for proximity. I would choose to re-engage with the living, with the family and the friends I had kept at arm's length while obsessed with the shadows of the past. The house, the town, they were no longer prisons of memory, but places to build new, honest connections. Forgiving the silence. I had to forgive not just Lillian but Aurelia too. Aurelia's silence and secrecy were born from her own guilt and fear. A flawed human attempt to protect me. I would choose to see the history not as a lie, but as a complicated truth carried by imperfect, loving people. My own past silences, the questions I never asked, the assumptions I made, would be recognized and gently retired. Living without the debt. Lillian's penance was rooted in guilt. My own life must be rooted in grace. I would not carry the debt paid in stone forward. I would take the clarity I had gained, the knowledge that love was always present, even in absence, and apply it to my own life. I would live with courage, not self-condemnation. I returned to the house. The afternoon light was soft, spilling across the familiar floorboards. The kitchen table, the spot where I had first held the unsent letter, was empty now. I went upstairs into Aurelia's room. The wardrobe doors were still slightly ajar. The false panel closed, but its secret known. The journal and the key were put away. The silence of the house, which had been old and listening, suffocating and expectant, was finally settled and clear. It was no longer the silence of a secret waiting to be told, but the quiet of a story finally understood. The heavy weight that had pressed down on this house for 40 years was gone. I walked to the window. The restless sea salt air felt lighter, cleaner. The mystery was gone, but the love remained. I knew I wouldn't leave town tomorrow. The destination was not an island, but here. And my own right to return, to a life unburdened by the ghosts of what-ifs, was earned simply by choosing to begin again. Did you enjoy the story? And from which city are you listening? Tell me in the comments. I always love hearing from you. If this story touched your heart, you can support me with a super thanks. Your support helps me continue creating more stories for you. 2 more beautiful life stories are on your screen right now. I hope you enjoy them too. There's so much more waiting for you on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story with love and respect.